Niall Ferguson, thank you very much for joining us here at the Film Global Institute. If you were to design the rule of law in your ideal world, what would the key components be?
Well, I wouldn't try and do that, because one of the lessons of history is that those who try to create ideal utopian legal systems, Napoleon Bonaparte was one, generally fail, and that the most successful legal systems have evolved over time, the English common law being the most successful. And nobody sat down and designed the English common law from first principles. It evolved on the basis of precedent and on the basis of judges, quote unquote, discovering the law. It evolved through the organic evolution of statutes from a representative parliament, through sometimes literally trial and error. And I think we can learn a lot from studying the history of law. A lot about the way economies work. Let me illustrate this point. When economists talk about the law and use expressions like the rule of law or even common law, they are usually offering you a stylized fact. They tend not to look too closely at how the legal system actually works. And this is a really important distinction, because take the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is the most important event in economic history. It's the thing that changes the game. And it starts in the United Kingdom. It starts in the British Isles. Now, the interesting thing about that is that, in fact, the legal system of the late 18th century would not have struck you at the time as particularly conducive to an economic revolution. Think, for example, of how Charles Dickens writes about the English law in the early 19th century in a book like Bleak House. He makes huge fun of how inefficient it is, how Procrustean the whole court system is. It's one of his most funny passages when he mocks the Court of Chancery. And yet, this very legal system that Dickens mocked turned out to produce, or at least to coexist with, the biggest economic revolution of them all, the Industrial Revolution. So I don't think one can easily generalize about this kind of thing. You have to get down and dirty in the historical detail and start looking at the precise process whereby the evolving system of common law proved flexible and responded to innovations from entrepreneurs. I think that's the key. The entrepreneurs would come up with innovations and the judges would kind of adapt. That process of adaptation, that organic process of evolution, turns out to be really crucial.
You spoke at length last night about degeneration. Was there ever a zenith?
Yeah, I think you could certainly talk about a zenith, because it's clear that institutions, as they evolve, get to a point which is not perfection, but good. And then over time, it appears that they're inclined to degenerate. One of my fundamental insights from historical study is that even the best designed institutions, think of the US Constitution, will tend to deteriorate over time because of human error, because of the way we are, human frailty. So I think there probably was a zenith in the US when American institutions were not perfect, but really well designed to promote innovation and economic growth. And it sure wasn't last year. I think you could go back and say, using the data sets that I was citing, the 1980s were pretty good. But these data sets don't go much further back than the 1980s. In fact, if you really want to see what a dynamic economy looked like, you'd want to go back even further. The US was pretty astonishing in the 1950s when it came to generating innovation, growth and jobs. And that's a time that we probably should spend more time studying, because it was, in terms of the relationship between government and the market, a really pretty good time. The federal government played an important and very positive role in fostering innovation, not least through the Defense Department, but also in the way, for example, that interstate highways were built. And yet it did not get in the way of innovation in the private sector. And the amount of regulation, at least in some important sectors, was really relatively limited. Interesting thing about the 1950s is that the financial sector was quite highly regulated, one of the legacies of the Depression and World War II. So this is the kind of comparative approach that I think we need to take. We need to look back at different periods and say, well, how exactly was the relationship between the public and private sector organized then? Because it's hard to believe that what we have right now is the best that we could do.
If the rest of the world were to look at institutions, what should they be copying?
A really important first step is to look as we can at the whole universe of data that we have. I mean, institutions are a complex thing to talk about. There are 22 different measures of institutional quality that the World Economic Forum looks at when it's trying to assess competitiveness. And some countries are good at some of those things and terrible at others. The US has great investor protection, but it's absolutely terrible in some other areas, shockingly so, according at least to those data. I think that comparative approach is really a good place to start, but it has to be over a significant time frame, and that's where the limits of these data sets become obvious, because they don't go back very far. We really need always to think, I think, in at least a 100-year time frame to get a sense of the possibilities, the different combinations that exist, the different kinds of institutions that can be possible. For a country like China, second largest economy in the world, most populous country in the world, a huge moment of truth has arrived. And the moment of truth is this: does the Communist Party accept the dominance of law? Does it subordinate itself to the rule of law? Does it accept that an independent judiciary might find against it? I think unless it does, there's a ceiling to what China can achieve. Well, Jim Robinson, my colleague at Harvard, and Darren Asamoah published an extremely interesting book about institutions and economic development just last year. And their argument was China can't make it, that China will ultimately fall victim to the problems that we associate with rent-seeking elites and corruption if he doesn't make the leap to the rule of law, because the rule of law guarantees certain things, at least as they define it. It guarantees that there will be equal opportunity. It ensures that a tiny elite won't simply capture the profits of the hard work of the majority of the population. So at least on their terms, this is non-negotiable. If you don't have certain basic protections of individual rights, usually starting with property rights but not ending there, then it's highly unlikely that you will have the kind of dynamic, innovative economy that will take you from the middle income to the upper income. Innovation is less likely where property rights are not protected. You know, why would you really bother innovating if your private property rights or your intellectual property rights were going to be violated as soon as you started to make serious money? China now has to generate its own intellectual property. It has to innovate in its own right. And that's happening. I mean, certainly measured in terms of patents, there's a lot of innovation now going on in China. China's done all the right things educationally. It's massively improved what happens, for example, in its engineering departments and in some of its other hard science departments. But what's not there is a real legal system. There are hardly any lawyers in China, a couple of 100,000. There are hardly any judges. So that's the missing piece in China's institutional development. And the big challenge is, as you rightly say, how do you get a functioning legal system in a relatively short space of time when history suggests that it can take hundreds of years to evolve of its own accord?
I want to ask you about lawyers, but let me start with talking about bureaucracy, over-institutionalization. Let's take India, for example. By some accounts, it could be over-institutionalized, over-bureaucratized, but yet there's still so much wrong with India in those respects.
You shouldn't measure institutions by quantity, but by quality. There's nothing good in itself about regulation and regulators. Indeed, you can have a pathology where bureaucracy becomes a self-perpetuating phenomenon and the rent-seeking goes on via the application of red tape and the extraction of fees officially and unofficially from business. So I think India nicely illustrates the difficulty that some legacies of British rule were distinctly negative. If the common law was a very positive legacy for a place like Hong Kong, for India, the civil service mentality, the bureaucratic mentality, was a distinctly negative legacy. And it took a long time for Indian politicians to begin to grapple with that. I mean, India didn't really start to reform its bureaucracy until the 1990s. And it still has a very long way to go. So I think when we're talking about institutions and when we're talking about the rule of law, we have to be very careful about just assuming that more law, more lawyers, and more regulators are the answer. Indeed, even in the United States, as I've been trying to argue, you begin to see the problem that India has in spades, which is the problem of too much of all of these things. And that's just as bad as too little. So it's quality that matters, not quantity. And that's true, I think, right across the board.
So in China, we do currently have a growing court of public opinion with issues like pollution, food security. But it's not a given that those translate into democracy, for one, into rule of law.
I think one has to recognize that the public sphere should be free as possible, and free expression of opinion is an integral part of what a free society is. But if it is unmediated, if you go straight from the court of public opinion to the gallows or the firing squad, then some pretty ugly stuff is going to happen. And that's what representative government and the rule of law are about. Often they are about restraining the powerful state, the executive, but they also are about restraining public opinion, restraining the tyranny of the majority. And a good society, and I use the word good very advisedly, is one in which there is a separation of powers, there is due process, there is transparency, there is accountability, and there is appeal. And I think the relationship right now between the state and the blogosphere, the micro-blogosphere in China, is very interesting. I think a lot of Western observers are somewhat naive about this. The typical reader of the New York Times imagines a kind of healthy critical pressure being applied on the party by freedom-loving bloggers. It's not quite as simple as that. There's a rather interesting relationship in which microblogs allow the party to see what people are upset about. It's actually a terrific source of intelligence about popular attitudes.
We've spoken at length about public sentiment, rule of law. Hong Kong people are very proud of their rule of law. There are some very solid institutions in Hong Kong built around that.
Of all Asian economies, Hong Kong's rule of law has improved the most in the last decade. So far from deteriorating since the handover of power, it's actually got better. And that's something that people in Hong Kong should be really proud of, and the rest of us should envy and admire. I think the most encouraging thought of all is that mainland China will look at Hong Kong, see the benefits of these robust legal institutions, see the benefits of a really high quality bar and really high quality judiciary, and want to adopt them. When a new leadership in Beijing talks about the importance of law and argues that anti-corruption is the most important thing to be done on the mainland, the only credible way in which that can be achieved is for the mainland to have institutions that are more like Hong Kong's than they currently are. Now, I am very doubtful that this can be achieved easily, because the vested interests that would lose out on the mainland if the whole of China became like Hong Kong would be very, very great. Could they get there over a period of decades? It is not impossible.
Mr. Niall Ferguson, thank you very much for joining us here at Fung Global Institute.
Thank you.